Hey, what's up, sports fans? Welcome to Common Sense Sports Talk. My name is Andrew Freeman, and in today's episode, I'm going to be having my sixth entry into my 2019 NFL preview series. In this episode, I'm going to be taking a look at the AFC North. Now, before I get started in this preview, I just want to say that if you like this video and are a fan of the channel as a whole, please leave a like and subscribe below. It really goes a long way. And I just want to say for all you subscribers out there that it really means a lot to me. Any support goes a very long way towards building this channel. And of course, if you have anything that you want to discuss about this episode or the NFL as a whole, please leave that in the comment section below. I'd be definitely looking forward to discussing any matters as it pertains to the NFL and sports in general. So we're going to get started here with the Cincinnati Bengals. And with the Cincinnati Bengals here, last year was the last season finally of the Marvin Lewis era. It just seems like everything's been stale in Cincinnati for such a long time. So finally they move on from Marvin Lewis and they bring in Zach Taylor, who was the offensive coordinator last season for the Los Angeles Rams. And while he didn't do any of the play calling, he helped design and put together the game plan for that offense on a week-to-week basis. So you bring in Zach Taylor, who has that Sean McVay influence to his offense. He's a young, bright offensive mind, and you're hoping he can kind of be a spark plug for this organization that has kind of been stale over the past 2 decades or so. So while you may expect to bring in a young coach like him would kind of put an influx of aggressiveness and a new change in philosophy for this organization, this offseason was kind of the same as it has always been in Cincinnati, where they weren't very active in free agency, and instead of going out there and spending big money to bring in guys that could potentially help them both in the short term and long term, they were content to just re-sign some of their core key players and kind of sit out the free agency period as a whole. Now, with that being said, they did make a couple of additions to this team, particularly on the offensive line and in the secondary. On the offensive line, they brought in John Miller from the Buffalo Bills, an offensive guard, on a 3-year, $16.5 million contract. Now, John Miller isn't a great player or even a good player by any means, but he's a solid, okay-ish starter, and he's a guy that will compete on that offensive line for them and probably will be starting this season. Now, the Bengals' offensive line has been in flux over the past few seasons, and it's one of the reasons why they went from a consistent playoff contending team to a very mediocre to below average team over the past few seasons. So they're hoping that by adding him into this lineup, they can help to stabilize their offensive line just a little bit more, with some support also coming from the draft. In terms of another big move that they made, well, not really a big move, but they brought in some help at the cornerback position, signing B.W. Webb from the New York Giants, a slot cornerback, on a 3-year, $10.5 million contract. And, that's not a big deal whatsoever. This is kind of the signing that it's kind of a prove-it deal for B.W. Webb. He had a good season last year with the Giants as a slot corner, and it's kind of a low-risk, somewhat high-reward signing for this team. Hopefully improves the secondary. If he doesn't, it's not like they're investing that much into him anyway. In terms of losses, nothing really key for them here. They lost Tyler Kroft at tight end to the Buffalo Bills. He was a solid contributor for them over the past few seasons, where you look at Tyler Eifert, just hasn't stayed healthy. Kroft has been a guy that has stepped in and occasionally has been productive in this offense. You also lose a guy like Vontaze Burfict, which for me, good riddance. He should have been gone a long time ago. A guy that has problems with PEDs, intentionally trying to injure guys on the field. I thought Cincinnati would have been best to just cut their losses with him a few seasons ago, and they just have kind of had him stick around for really no reason here. He's not even that good of a player anymore anyway. And then you also lose some veterans like Michael Johnson as a defensive end, and Vincent Ray, another linebacker who's been in the organization for quite a bit. Again, nothing major here, but some pretty significant in terms of the veterans that were on this team for a while nonetheless. So going from the free agency to the draft, when you look at what the Bengals did, before the draft, it was rumored that they could possibly be in the contention for a quarterback in the first round. And certainly they had their opportunity when you look at Dwayne Haskins fell pretty much right to them at the 11th pick in the draft. And I thought with bringing in a guy like Zach Taylor as an offensive-minded young head coach We know the Bengals typically are very patient with their coaching staff. They're willing to let them grow into their responsibility and let them stay for quite a while to grow that continuity basis. It made sense for me that they would be aggressive in going after a young quarterback in this draft to replace Andy Dalton, and Zach Taylor can then coach that guy up to be the franchise quarterback and build a long-term relationship there. So I thought it made perfect sense when you have Haskins, who played practically in their backyard at Ohio State. That made a lot of sense for me. But they ended up going in a different direction, building up the offensive line once again, drafting Jonah Williams, offensive tackle out of Alabama. And I'll say this about that. For me, I think I would much rather prefer that they went after Dwayne Haskins in this draft. I thought it was, really right there for the taking for them, that he kind of fell right into their laps. But I will say the Bengals, they do not have an offensive line or even a young foundation at the offensive line at this moment. With a guy like Jonah Williams, yes, there were guys with higher ceiling on the board, like Andre Dillard, Jawan Taylor even. But Jonah Williams is a guy that you look at him as a prospect. He's very safe. He's got a very high floor. Not necessarily somebody that's going to be an all-pro or consistent Pro Bowl level player at his position. Not a guy that you're going to see as one of the elite left tackles or even right tackles at this in the NFL based off where they decide to put him. It sounds like they want him to be their starting left tackle long-term. But I think he was very similar to me coming into this draft as a guy like Mike McGlinchey last year out of Notre Dame when the 49ers drafted him. I didn't really see a high ceiling with McGlinchey, but he was a very safe pick going into that draft, and we saw him make an immediate impact for the 49ers on that offensive line last season. So the thinking does make sense to me with the Bengals here, getting Williams into the room here. Unfortunately, he's going to be out for the year with an injury, so that kind of is a setback for them. And it's kind of freaky how last year they drafted Billy Price in the first round. He was out all year with an injury. It's heartbreaking, I think, for the Bengals that they are trying to invest in this offensive line, and injuries are just kind of ruining that for them as they kind of build this up. But in terms of other picks in this draft for them, you look at what they did in the second and third round. Drew Sample at tight end. He can be kind of that Tyler Croft replacement, maybe even eventually a Tyler Eifert replacement for them in the future. In the third round, Jermaine Pratt, a linebacker out of NC State. Adding to that linebacking core, they run a 4-3 scheme in Cincinnati still, so he fits that pretty well. And they finally invested in the quarterback position in the fourth round with a guy like Ryan Finley, a quarterback out of NC State. Now, I actually graded Finley very similarly to Daniel Jones, who was drafted in the first round by the New York Giants. So I thought that was pretty good value by the Bengals to get Ryan Finley in the fourth round. I thought he was more of a day two, second, maybe even third round type of draft pick here. He doesn't really have a great arm necessarily, but he's very efficient, a pretty accurate passer in the short to intermediate game. And he does have some similarities with Andy Dalton in their play style. And I think that's a seamless transition then. If you're looking at him as a backup quarterback, you can run the same type of system with him or Andy Dalton there, should Andy Dalton go down with an injury. In terms of other picks that I like, Michael Jordan in the fourth round, an offensive guard out of Ohio State. He looks like a guy that's going to start right away for them. So that's pretty good value in the fourth round there if you can get a starter there. And then in the sixth round, I like what they did investing in the running back position. Travion Williams out of Texas A&M and Rodney Anderson, running back out of Oklahoma. With both of these guys, I had them graded much higher, especially Travion Williams, who really impressed me out of Texas A&M last year. I thought he was going to be a guy that would go in the fourth round. Instead, he falls all the way to the sixth round here. And then Rodney Anderson, you look at him, he was a guy that a lot of people were talking about as a second round, maybe even first round type of talent before knee injuries kind of took away his draft position. To get that value in the sixth round, that type of talent in the sixth round, I think is a worthy risk to take. So moving on from what they did in the offseason now to this roster as a whole and how it looks going into this season, we're going to start with the offense. And I think Zach Taylor, bringing him in from the Los Angeles Rams, he's going to bring that Shanahan-McVay style of offense where they're going to run that stretch zone run with a bunch of different route combinations down the field to get guys open. And maybe it's possible that he can add some juice to an otherwise average offensive unit on paper. Now, I've said it before, maybe mentioned it briefly earlier. But Andy Dalton is going to be their starting quarterback for the foreseeable future, it looks like. And I thought it would have been in the Bengals' best interest to move on from him, or at least get their successor for him in this offseason in the draft. They decided to go in a different direction, obviously. So I think the Bengals, they need to consider moving on from Andy Dalton at some point. This may be a make or break year for him at the position. And that certainly isn't going to be helped with the fact that, even though the receiving threats on this team are solid, they are already dealing with some injuries already. You look at A.J. Green, obviously, that's the big one. He's going to miss the early portion of the season with a significant ankle injury. That's just a big blow. Him and Andy Dalton have a very good chemistry. A.J. Green, when healthy, he's one of the top 5 to 10 receivers in all of football still, a guy that I think will be a future Hall of Famer someday. That's a big blow for this offense. But they do have a solid replacement for him in Tyler Boyd, who had a good season last year as their number 2 wide receiver. And you're hoping that you can get something out of John Ross, who kind of looked like a bust his first year as a wide receiver coming out of the draft, but slowly has kind of shown that he will have a role in this offense, quite possibly as a deep threat specialist. Other than those guys, though, there really isn't that much depth on this receiving core as a whole. You're looking at the tight end group. Obviously, Tyler Eifert, when he's healthy, he's a very good option as a receiver in the middle of the field and as a vertical spacer, but he just doesn't stay healthy ever. I don't think you can rely on him over a full 16-game season. And also, what will hurt Andy Dalton is the offensive line. I know they've tried to do as much as they can to kind of invest in this offensive line, to build it up with some young pieces, but unfortunately, it's starting to look like one of the worst in all of football this season. Obviously, Jordan Williams is going to be out for the year, like I mentioned, and Billy Price, their first-round draft pick last year, has already gotten benched at this point for Trey Hopkins, who is a below-average starter to replaceable backup at best at this point in his career. And these moves really hurt their offensive line because they were looking at a lineup where they would start Jonah Williams at left tackle, Cordy Glenn at left guard. Now he's going to have to play left tackle. You're starting a rookie and Michael Jordan at the left guard spot. They signed John Miller in the offseason, so he's set at right guard. But that right tackle position for me is just really rough. They decided to re-sign Bobby Hart, who is one of the worst right tackles in all football, if not the worst right tackle. He is just plain awful, and he's going to get abused by a lot of these pass rushers in this division, I think. Now, fortunately, for this Bengals team, they have a great staple of running backs here, and we know Zach Taylor, coming from that Shanahan style of offense, he's going to want to feature the running game quite a bit. And I think Joe Mixon is a guy that fits perfectly into that zone stretch scheme. He's very explosive, a second-round pick a couple of seasons ago. He could have a breakout season. And there's also some good depth at this spot as well. I already mentioned the 2 draft picks, who I think could be very good value picks for them, but they still have Giovanni Bernard, who is more of a third-down specialist type of back. Again, there's some pretty solid talents here at the running back position. And if they're going to have any success on offense this year, it's going to start with the running game and with those running backs. So transitioning to the defense, they had one of the worst defenses in all football last season for the Bengals, but I think it should be better this year. This isn't a defense that is bereft of talent, especially when you look at what their depth chart looks like up front. There's some solid talent here and some guys that can make some plays in both the running game and the passing game. Obviously, it all starts with Geno Atkins, a guy who's a consistent Pro Bowler, one of the most underrated players in all of football, yearly it seems like. You have a nice run stopper then, and Andrew Billings at the other defensive tackle spot. But at defensive end, I really like the depth here, starting with Carlos Dunlap, a very big, long defensive end, very good as a run stopper, maybe not the most explosive pass rusher, but very solid nonetheless. Then you have guys like Sam Hubbard, Carl Lawson, Jordan Willis. I think it's a very nice young rotation of pass rushers that they have here. And if they can get the pass rush going and add some juice to this unit, it can go a very long way from improving this defense into an above-average unit this season. Now, unfortunately for them, linebacker is a bit of a weak spot. Right now, they're set to start Preston Brown, who isn't terrible, but Jordan Evans and Nick Vigil are average to slightly below average starters at this point at best. So you're going to have to see that linebacker position have to get upgraded at some point in the future. But when you look at the secondary, which is a big weak spot for them last season, I think there is some underrated talent in this secondary unit. First of all, William Jackson, I think, is one of the rising stars at cornerback. He's a guy that nobody talks about because the Bengals have just not been very good. But I think if the Bengals were a winning team and their defense was performing better, he would be a guy that we talk about as one of the better young corners in all of football. He is very good, a very good athlete, and he has very good ball skills and ball instincts as well. And then another player that I really like in this defense is Jesse Bates. Going into his second season, he's a guy that's a very good playmaker, a very good free safety type of guy, a kind of a ball hawk in the secondary, if you will. I really like that combination there, building that secondary going into the future. And there's some decent depth as well at the cornerback spot. Drake Kirkpatrick, he's nothing special as a starter, but he's still sticking around. Darqueze Dennard, a guy that I liked as a slot corner. I already mentioned the signing of B.W. Webb. If there is one weakness in the safety group, it's at the other safety spot. Sean Williams is slated to start at the strong safety. He isn't particularly good at this point in his career. So overall, when I look at this Bengals team, unfortunately, I just don't see this team having that very much of a ceiling, even though they bring in the new head coach here, moving on from that stale Marvin Lewis era of football. I think worst case scenario, this team could very well end up being one of the worst teams in all of football. They're in a tough division, and wins are going to be hard to come by, especially with that offensive line and some of the injuries already facing this team on offense. I just think they could potentially struggle here early on, and they might not recover as the season progresses. Best case scenario, they get healthy in time. The offense starts to click with Zach Taylor. The defense improves. I think they could win as many as 6 games. Again, not a very high ceiling on this group as a whole. For my final prediction, I have the Bengals going 4-12 on the season, finishing last place in the AFC North. So moving on to the next team, we're going to take a look at the Baltimore Ravens, who coming off a wild card loss. Unfortunately, they rallied late in the year behind Lamar Jackson, moving on officially from the Joe Flacco era. Now it's up to Lamar Jackson to be the quarterback of the future and the quarterback of the present for this team. And when you look at what happened in this offseason for the Ravens, they lost a lot of talent on that defense. As much as it was Lamar Jackson carrying this team literally on his back to the playoffs in the running game and the way they kind of reinvented themselves late in the season to be a triple option type of offense, it really was a defense that took this team to the playoffs last year, and they lost some core members of that unit. First, some of the big names here. C.J. Mosley, who's been a leader in their linebacking core, they lose him to a big contract to the New York Jets. I really thought that they were going to do anything they could to keep him in Baltimore. He was kind of the heir apparent to Ray Lewis for this team, and unfortunately, they lose that type of talent. He was one of the top 5 to 7 inside linebackers in all of football. You also lose their best pass rusher from last year, Zadarius Smith, to the Packers on a big contract. I thought that was, not the worst thing in the world. They still have some talent at that edge position. The Baltimore Ravens have done a great job, I think, in the past of evaluating and developing pass rushers overall. So, again, whenever a pass rusher leaves the Baltimore Ravens, I don't think it's a big deal because they just seem to be able to replace those guys anyway. But they also lost a big leader in their locker room in Terrell Suggs as well, a guy who's been with the organization for such a long time, a very good player. Even though he's not the same as he once was as a pass rusher, he can still get the job done in a rotational aspect. So he leaves for the Arizona Cardinals. And then you also lose Eric Weddle, who's kind of a nice veteran presence in the secondary for that team. He leaves for the Los Angeles Rams. They also have some turnover on the offensive side of the ball, specifically in the wide receiving core. John Brown signed a deal with the Bills, and Michael Crabtree went to the Arizona Cardinals as well. So a lot of players to replace here. But I thought they did a pretty good job of going out there and addressing some needs, especially on defense. When you look at getting Earl Thomas on a 4-year, $55 million contract to be their free safety, getting him from the Seattle Seahawks. Now, if there's one concern with Earl Thomas at this stage in his career, is that he is a bit older, going into his 30s, and he's a bit injury prone. The last 2 seasons, he has ended on IR due to some serious significant injuries. So there is some concerns there. But when he is healthy, he's still one of the top 3 safeties in all of football, an absolute great ball hawk, still a very instinctive and athletic player at this stage in his career still. I like that signing for them there. And then later on, what they did to address some of the needs on defense, they brought in some pass rushers on the cheap. When you look at Shane Ray and Parnell McPhee on 1-year contracts on basically veteran minimum type of deals, those guys, especially when you look at Shane Ray, are guys that were highly touted a few seasons ago, but kind of haven't really worked out as players in the past few seasons. And they're hoping that in the system, they can kind of break out and have some production for them as well. And then we look at on the offensive side of the ball. I mentioned before that they went to a purely run triple option type of scheme. They went out and signed a guy like Mark Ingram from the New Orleans Saints on a 3-year, $15 million contract to be their bell cow running back for this offense going into this season. So moving on from free agency to the draft, it was apparent that, one, they needed to address the defense and replace some of those guys that left in free agency. But two, and maybe more importantly, they needed to get some weapons for Lamar Jackson to throw to, because one of the big problems with Lamar Jackson last year was that his passing does leave a lot to be desired. So you need to get some talent in that receiving core to maybe help him and really kind of streamline his development as a passer. So in the first round, they ended up drafting Marquise Hollywood Brown, wide receiver out of Oklahoma. He's the best deep threat in the draft, arguably the best wide receiver in this draft as a whole. He's a guy that's going to add another element to this offense. And, he's a guy that they had John Brown to be their deep threat last year. I think Brown is a lot more explosive at this stage in his career. He's obviously a lot younger, and he's a guy that could have some special playmaking threats, be a special playmaking threat for this offense. Maybe not a guy that will put up prolific numbers at the NFL level, but he can have a huge impact on the way that defenses have to respect his speed, which will open up the running game even more for this offense. So I like that pick for them. And then they did not have a second-round pick due to trades, so they had 2 third-round picks instead. And one of them was Jalen Ferguson, outside linebacker out of Louisiana Tech. This is a guy that early in the draft process was looked at as a first-round type of talent due to his production in college. I believe he had 17 sacks last season, if I'm not mistaken. But he had a historically awful NFL draft combine. His numbers in terms of the athletic testing were just not good. And he's a guy that fell in the draft as a process because of that. But I think he landed in the right spot for him, because the Ravens, they don't really value high athletic numbers. They value guys with good technique and guys that can kind of create pressure from a variety of different angles. And that's what Ferguson can do. He's a guy that can rush from the outside and the inside. So a very versatile player on that outside linebacker defensive line type of position for them. And they also got a guy like Miles Boykin in the third round as well, wide receiver out of Notre Dame. Marquise Brown was a speedster that they drafted. Boykin's kind of the opposite. Doesn't really have a great athletic number, but he's a big-bodied receiver that's very good as a possession guy and as a red zone threat. So he's going to help out Lamar Jackson in terms of Jackson's tendency to be a little bit inaccurate with his passes. Boykin can help mask that by being a guy that has a very nice catch radius and can catch some tough contested catches for this offense. Some other picks that I like for this team. In the fourth round, I like the picks of Justice Hill, running back out of Oklahoma State. Kind of a shifty, speedy type of third down scat back for this team. And then Penn Powers, offensive guard out of Oklahoma. Again, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to draft offensive linemen from Oklahoma. They do a nice job of developing those guys, I think, on the offensive line. And then the one pick that I really think was a sneaky value for them was Trace McSorley, quarterback out of Penn State. And they're going to kind of use him, I think, as a Taysom Hill type of guy that, when you think of the New Orleans Saints and the way they use Taysom Hill, they're going to do the same thing with Trace McSorley here. Not only can he be a kind of third-string backup quarterback for them, but they can use him on special teams. They can use him as a wide receiver in certain packages, as a running back in certain packages, and they can do a lot of gadget plays with him because he does have really good athletic ability. And with his ability to be a somewhat accurate passer, he adds another dimension to their offense. So I thought that was a sneaky pick for them. I know that Taysom Hill was a big thorn in their side when the Saints played the Ravens last season. So I think they saw what the Saints could do with a guy like that, and that's why they valued McSorley here in the sixth round to kind of be a similar type of player for them. So transitioning from the draft now, we're going to look at this roster as a whole and kind of break it down, starting with the offense, of course. Now, their offensive coordinator, Greg Roman, is a guy that is going to run a true run-based triple option offense. He kind of did the same thing when Colin Kaepernick was the quarterback in San Francisco a few years ago when he was a quarterback over there and they went to the Super Bowl. They're going to do the same thing here with Lamar Jackson, using his just absolutely special electric running ability and use that to their advantage. I think John Harbaugh or Jim Harbaugh. Actually, no, John Harbaugh. I keep on mixing those guys up. I think he said earlier in the offseason that, in terms of rushing attempts for Lamar Jackson, that you should take the over on the NFL record for most rushing attempts by a quarterback in a season. But I think ultimately, if this Ravens team is going to have a Super Bowl type of ceiling on this roster, Lamar Jackson is going to need to show improvement as a passer. I've heard some good things about him in training camp and from what I've seen in the preseason so far, but I'm going to need to see him actually do it in live NFL games. If he can do that, that will be a long way towards his development as a consistent franchise quarterback for this team and for helping this offense take that next level to being a good offense. But with that said, the identity of this offense is going to run the ball early and often, pretty much all the time on any down and distance. They're going to look to run the ball, and they have lots of depth at running back to be able to do that. First, obviously, Mark Ingram is a power, versatile back for them, but they also have Gus Edwards, who had a big year once Lamar Jackson was inserted into the starting lineup. Kenneth Dixon is a guy that's a nice power back at this stage. And then Justice Hill is a guy that could have a big impact as more of that change of pace, speedy, shifty type of back in this offense. So overall, lots of options that they can use at the running back group, and they're going to be helped out by an offensive line that is absolutely built to beat up teams up front. Obviously, you still have Marshall Yanda there at right guard, who to me is going to be a future Hall of Famer someday. Even though he's older and not the same player he once was, he's still a very high-level impact type of starter at the right guard position, still a very good player. And you still have guys like Ronnie Stanley, a guy who's one of the most underrated left tackles in all football. He's really developed into one of the better young tackles in the game. It looks like Ben Powers is going to be starting as a rookie at left guard, so you got to like that there. Matt Skura is solid at center. And then Orlando Brown is just a big, massive human being at right tackle. Even though he's not the most fleet of foot in the pass protection, he's a guy that can absolutely maul you in the running game. And that's what this team's going to want to do. They're going to want to run the ball, and they're going to do it pretty effectively this season. They put up historic rushing numbers once Lamar Jackson was in the starting lineup last season at quarterback, and I think they're going to replicate that over a 16-game season now with this core now established. Now, what could end up helping this offense even more is if their young receivers can actually develop into a legitimate receiving core, but unfortunately, they just lack the proven playmakers that you'd want from this type of running offense to make plays on the field. I think Marquise Brown, if he's healthy, will spread the field vertically nicely for them, and they have some depth at tight end. When you look at some young guys like James Hurst, Hayden Hurst, who could develop as their first-round pick last season. Mark Andrews had a pretty solid season last year, and they re-signed Nick Boyle, who's more of a blocking tight end, but he's certainly capable in the passing game as well. So ultimately, I think this offense has average talents overall, but they could outproduce that talent level based on the scheme and based off of the fact that we're really not going to see an offense like this in the NFL this season. It really is a unique offense that they're going to be running here in Baltimore. So we'll see how it works out ultimately. Now, transitioning to the defense, unfortunately for the Ravens, they lost a lot of key players. And while they did bring in some guys to kind of help stymie that, this team should still be a top 10 unit, I think, this season. But I don't see them as an elite top 3 unit that they were for the majority of last year, especially late in the season when they really clicked and they really locked in. But when you look at this talent on this defense as a whole, I really like the defensive line here. You know they're going to stop the run. As always, the Baltimore Ravens are always good at stopping the run. Brandon Williams and Michael Pierce are just two massive space-eating guys in the middle of that defense at nose tackle, and really just two nose tackle type of guys in the middle of that defense. It's going to be really hard to run on those guys in the middle, so they're going to have to go to the edge. But fortunately for them, Baltimore does value bigger, more physical, edge-setting edge players in this defense. And you got to like what they have there. Guys like Matt Judon, who's a very underrated player. Parnell McPhee, who they brought in, he's a very big physical edge setter in the running game. And then you have some guys like Tyus Bauer, Tim Williams, and the aforementioned Jalen Ferguson, who can contribute as rotational pass rushers. Overall, this team has a very solid foundation up front, and they're going to be able to stop the run and get after the quarterback from a variety of different angles, using stunts, using different pressure schemes, using different blitzes. That's the way that Baltimore traditionally creates pressure and create sack opportunities and turnover opportunities with their front seven. That's the way it's done. Now, speaking of this front seven, one question mark for me is their linebacking position. Obviously, losing C.J. Mosley is a big deal. They still have a solid player in Patrick Onuwasea. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name entirely, but he's a solid player overall. But the lack of depth here is concerning for me overall. So if they suffer injuries there, they just don't really have that high-end talent to make up for the loss of the C.J. Mosley, unfortunately. I think one thing that'll help them out, though, is that their secondary is one of the best in all of football. Obviously, it starts with Marlon Humphrey, who's a young shutdown quarterback that not a lot of people talk about, but he doesn't really have the greatest ball skills in the world in terms of creating turnovers, but he just takes the opposing wide receiver out of the game. He's big, he's long, he's athletic, he's physical, and he's complemented by some veteran players at the cornerback spots, such as Jimmy Smith and Brandon Carr and Anthony Averett, guys that are very solid in coverage as well. Overall, their cornerbacks are very good, and they're complemented by a safety unit that may be one of the better duos in all of football. Look at Earl Thomas as their free safety, and then Tony Jefferson as a strong safety playing more in the box. Overall, this is one of the better secondaries in all of football, and they're going to absolutely lock down receivers. And when you combine that with the way they can create pressure up front, traditionally in Baltimore, that's a good recipe for a good defense. So overall, that's kind of how I see the defense working out this season. Now, overall for the Ravens, I think worst case scenario, if Lamar Jackson takes a significant step back and has like a sophomore slump at the quarterback position, this defense takes a step back. They can have a worst case scenario of 6 wins this season. Ultimately, again, when you're running such a unique offensive system, it can either be a great benefit to you or it will backfire on you completely. Worst case scenario, it backfires on them and they're kind of a below average team. But I just don't see that being the case with a John Harbaugh coach team. John Harbaugh is one of the best coaches in all football. He routinely puts together an overachieving team every single year. So I think best case scenario, they're an 11-win team. They're a team that could potentially win the division here in the AFC North. I have them going 9-7, not winning the division, but certainly competing for a wild card spot in the AFC as a whole. So I really like the Baltimore Ravens this year, even though I know some people are kind of down on them going to the season. I think they're still going to be in the hunt regardless of some of the losses in the offseason. So moving on now to the most exciting team to talk about, I think, in the AFC North, the Cleveland Browns. Coming off a very interesting year last year. It was the last year of the Hugh Jackson era. He got fired mid-season. And then we saw their current coach, as of right now, Freddie Kitchens, step up as the offensive coordinator while Greg Williams was the head coach or interim head coach. And then Freddie Kitchens did such a great job developing Baker Mayfield when he took over in the offense, and did just such a great job with the offense in terms of helping them kind of take that next step and that next leap as an offense, that Freddie Kitchens got the job to be their head coach this season. And there's a lot of excitement in Cleveland due to some of the additions that they made to help out their rising young star quarterback. And we got to start with the big one, Odell Beckham Jr., trading a first, a third-round pick, and Jabril Peppers for him. To me, that was an absolute coup. Odell Beckham Jr. is one of the top 3 to 4 wide receivers in all of football. An absolute true number 1 for Baker Mayfield to throw to. You got to love that trade regardless of some of the personalities in the locker room and the way he's kind of a diva off the field. I mean, the way I see it, most wide receivers are divas anyway. To bring in an elite talent like Odell Beckham Jr. to take this offense to the next level, you have to make that trade every single time. And I really applaud John Dorsey for being aggressive and making that happen. But that wasn't the only trade they made with the Giants. They also brought in another pass rusher and Olivier Vernon in that trade, trading Kevin Zeitler, their offensive guard last year, for him. I'll discuss later how that might come back to bite them a little bit. But Olivier Vernon is a guy that can take some pressure off of Myles Garrett in the pass rush department. A very good player as a whole, maybe not a true difference maker necessarily, but as a number 2 pass rusher, I think that was a good value for them there. And then they went all in. I'm trying to bring in some big names here. You look at Kareem Hunt. And on the defensive side of the ball, they signed Sheldon Richardson to a 3-year, $37 million contract. a guy that can add some pass rushing value at the defensive tackle position for this team. And I already mentioned that they lost some pieces on the offensive line. They brought in 2 offensive linemen and Kendall Lamb at right tackle and Eric Cush at offensive guard to compete for starting positions as well. No big losses for this team overall besides those trades that they made. So going on to the draft, they did not have a first-round pick, obviously, due to the trade with OBJ. So in the second round, they ended up drafting Greedy Williams, cornerback out of LSU. And by the way, that is just an awesome name for a quarterback, Greedy Williams, especially if he has some high turnover numbers. The one knock against Williams as a prospect, even though I have him as a first-round type of talent, is that he has a tendency to kind of take a few plays off in the run game, and he's not a very physical tackler. He's a guy that's kind of shies away from tackling as a whole, and that's fine if you're like Deion Sanders, where you just completely take your wide receiver out of the game. And if Greedy Williams can play to his potential and be a shutdown cornerback, that could be an issue that we're not really talking about, because ultimately I don't really care if my cornerbacks don't tackle as much, as long as they take their wide receiver out of the game completely and they shut down their guy and they get turnovers and all those exciting splash plays. That's all I really ask for in a quarterback. So I think that's why John Dorsey took the risk there, taking him in the second round. You pair him with Denzel Ward, and you have potentially a nice, young, rising star pair of shutdown cornerbacks in your secondary. Some other picks that I liked for them in this draft in the 5th round, Mack Wilson, linebacker out of Alabama. A lot of people thought that he should not have entered the draft so early. Maybe some people thought he should have maybe stayed in school an extra year. And there are some rumblings of off-the-field concerns, which is why he kind of slipped in the draft. But Mack Wilson does have a lot of talent at the linebacker position, and he's a guy that he may not contribute as much this year, at least early on, but he could be a very good starter, I think, for this team long-term. Overall, other than those 2 picks, though, this draft wasn't too exciting. Some of the other notable guys for them in the 4th round, Sheldrick Redwine to compete at safety out of Miami. Drew Forbes, offensive lineman out of Southeast Missouri State. Sion Takitaki, linebacker out of BYU in the 3rd round, a guy that can be kind of a special teamer, although I don't know if you want a special team type of talent in that early in the 3rd round, but nonetheless, it comes down to the boom or bust picks of Greedy Williams and Mack Wilson, and if those guys hits, it could be a solid draft class for the Browns to help out this team in the future. So breaking down this roster, of course, we're going to start with the offense, and I think when you look at these guys here, they have potential to be one of the most exciting, if not the most exciting offense in all of football, and it all starts with Baker Mayfield, who showed last season that he is a legitimate franchise-changing quarterback. He completely changed the culture of the Cleveland Browns last year when he entered in Week 3 against the Jets, leading into that comeback victory. He's a guy that is just a leader amongst men, a true alpha in the locker room, and he's got a great set of skill possession players surrounding him to really help him out and really bring out the best of him, I think, in this offense. You look at the running back position, you have a great duo in Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. Nick Chubb was a guy that looks like a guy who's going to be a Pro Bowl level talent for the next couple of seasons in his career, a guy that I thought was a steal for them in the 2nd round. And then when they get Kareem Hunt later on in the season, I just don't know how you're going to stop those 2 guys in the running game. They have the opportunity to really load up on Nick Chubb early on, and then Kareem Hunt can get the majority of the carries late in the season, and you have the opportunity where you can keep both of those guys fresh for a playoff run. You got to like that there. And then in the wide receiving core, there isn't as much depth as you would like, but you got to love the combination of Odell Beckham Jr. and Jarvis Landry at the wide receiver position, quite possibly the best wide receiving duo in all of football. One of the big reasons why I think this is going to work out with some of the personalities here in Cleveland is because, especially with OBJ, is that Odell Beckham Jr. and Jarvis Landry are best friends off the field as well. And I think when you combine that with an alpha dog like Baker Mayfield in the locker room, you have the potential for these guys to really mesh and really have a nice chemistry together. And they're going to create some exciting plays this season, and they're going to have some games where they're going to be putting up a lot of points in the passing game. just a very nice set of wide receivers as a whole. And then they're complemented at the tight end position as well with David Njoku, a very talented receiving threat at the tight end position, in the middle of the field, in the red zone, as a vertical spacer. Overall, these guys are just loaded with talent all across the board on offense. But if there's one concern I have for the Cleveland Browns and their offense, and whether they can kind of be one of the better units in all of football, it's got to be the offensive line, which could really hold this team back. Overall, there just isn't a lot of talent up front here, and they sacrificed a lot of talent on the offensive line in order to bring in some of these explosive playmakers. Now, I do like what they have at left guard and at the center position with Joe Bitonio and J.C. Treader at those positions respectively. But the tackles are an absolute mess for me. I do not trust Greg Robinson at left tackle, nor do I trust Chris Hubbard at right tackle. To me, that's one of the weaker pairs of tackles in all of football, and that could really come back to bite them, I think, when they start playing some of these teams with better pass rushers in their division this upcoming season. And then at right guard, it looks like Eric Kush is set to be their starter there. And I can tell you from experience, he was with the Bears last season, and I think he's fine for a game or two. If you have an injury at your guard position, he can kind of fill in there. But he is not very good at the point of attack. He struggles to get to the second level at times, and his pass protection can kind of be hit or miss there. So overall, I have a lot of concerns about this offensive line. It seems like Austin Corbett hasn't really panned out so far as a second-round pick for them, as a young developmental player on this offensive line. And Kendall Lamb, who they brought in from the Houston Texans, obviously I don't really put much stock into anybody that you get from the Houston Texans at offensive line. They're going to be pretty terrible there. So overall, I have a lot of question marks about the offensive line. If they can be just fine, though, I think that should be enough for this offense to be one of the better units in all of football. So moving on to the defense, they bring in a new defensive coordinator in Steve Wilks, who I think could actually be an upgrade over Greg Williams and help this unit really reach their potential. And it all starts with Myles Garrett, who I think is set to have a monster season. It's amazing to me that he was kind of interviewed before the season started, and he mentioned how Greg Williams last year only let him use one or two pass rush moves, when he was rushing the passer, which is just absolutely terrible coaching, in my opinion, because when you have a generational talent at defensive end like Myles Garrett, you want him to use every single tool in his toolbox there to get after the quarterback. So when you bring in a guy like Steve Wilks, who will allow him to play more freely, allow him to use more pass rushing moves, that can only do so much for Garrett, I think, in this defense. I think he could have a defensive player of the year type of impact on this defense and just absolutely terrorize opposing quarterbacks in this division. And they also have a solid group of pass rushers to complement him as well. I mentioned some of the additions that they brought in, Sheldon Richardson and Olivier Vernon, two very solid complementary pass rushers for this team. They also have a guy like Larry Ogunjobi, a defensive tackle, to bring some more interior pressure. Overall, you just got to like the talent up front here. If they can stay relatively healthy, this pass rush could be very dangerous, I think, for the Browns this season. And then when you move to the back seven, I really like their linebackers. Joe Schobert and Christian Kirksey are a very solid duo. Neither of them are stars necessarily, but they're both very solid against the run and against the pass. Very well-balanced players as a whole. If there are any concerns, though, for this defense, it is in the secondary. There is some talent here, don't get me wrong, especially when you look at Denzel Ward, who looks like a guy who's going to be a rookie of the year type of guy at the cornerback position before he kind of dealt with some injuries that kind of limited his production later on in the season. But Denzel Ward looks like a guy who could be a shutdown type of cornerback. You're hoping that Greedy Williams can step up and be a true number two, though, because the depth at corner isn't the best. Right now, Terrence Mitchell and TJ Carey are slated to be the other starting corners on this team, both on the outside and in the slots. I'm not a huge fan of either of those guys. And then at safety, while you do like Demarius Randall, and he did show some flashes of being a very good safety last season when he made that switch over from cornerback to safety, the other safety spot is a little bit in flux. They traded for Eric Murray for the Kansas City Chiefs in the offseason, but he's going to be a backup for them. They signed Morgan Burnett in the offseason, but he always gets injured. He's an older player. He's not really what he once was anyway. So I don't really know how much production they're going to get from the safety position. And that could really hurt them because if their pass rush can't get to the quarterback in time, that could open them up for a lot of big plays down the field in the passing game, which is what I really fear for this team as a whole. And what I fear for this defense as a whole overall. But overall, I think they will be a pretty solid defense right now when you look at them on paper. So when I look at the Cleveland Browns as a whole, looking at their schedule, I think worst case scenario, they're a 7-win team. That's if Baker Mayfield doesn't take the next step. That's if the holes in the defense are really kind of flare up for them. But there are enough talented stars on this team to really make up for that. And they're going to be a competitive playoff level team, I think, all year long. Best case scenario, I think, for them is that they win 10 games. And that's not necessarily because of their talent level, but more because the division they play in is just going to be very, very tough. We always know that the Steelers and Ravens are always going to be competitive every single year. So those guys are going to beat each other up, and that's going to really kind of limit the ceiling for all these teams. So I think the Browns go 9-7 on the season. Again, like the Ravens, they're going to be competing for the division, but I think they're going to be more of a wild card type of team in the 2019 season. So moving on to the final team in the AFC North, we have the Pittsburgh Steelers, who are hoping that they are no longer going to be a soap opera this season, because last year was, it was entertaining for me as a guy who's not a Steelers fan and kind of looking at them from the outside looking in. But you could just tell that the locker room and the chemistry issues really deteriorated this team over the course of the season last year, specifically late in the year. I think they were 7-3-1 at some point, and they ended up collapsing, absolutely collapsing, and missing the playoffs. Now, you may say that the Carolina Panthers were a worse collapse last season in terms of record and where they started at. But for me, it has to be the Steelers, because at least with the Carolina Panthers, I can say Cam Newton got hurt, and because he got injured, that really, limited whether the Panthers were going to make the playoffs anyway. Because if your quarterback's not the same type of dude, or he's out of the game completely, your season's basically over anyway, unless you have Nick Foles. So when you look at the Steelers, the reason why they collapsed was all because of internal turmoil with this franchise. It first started with the Le'Veon Bell contract situation and him not signing his franchise tender, not signing a long-term extension, and then eventually not even playing at all the entire season. The offensive line were calling him out openly in the media. That was a really bad look for this team. It was kind of a distraction for them early on in the year. And then you got Ben Roethlisberger calling out teammates on his radio show, which is just a terrible look. And you don't want that from the leader of your franchise. And then finally, I think the straw that kind of broke the camel's back, so to speak, was Antonio Brown and just all the antics leading up to him basically quitting on the team in Week 17 against the Bengals. Just a lot of just garbage going on in this organization that they needed to clean up, a lot of baggage to kind of get rid of. And that's kind of what they did. They went for a total culture overhaul this offseason, getting rid of some of those guys and letting some of those guys go in free agency. So they let Le'Veon Bell sign with the Jets on a lucrative contract. And then they trade away Antonio Brown on basically pennies on the dollar, only getting a 3rd and 5th round pick for him. Trading him to the Oakland Raiders. And, while they're losing a generational type of talent, I think at the wide receiver position, obviously a guy who's going to be in the Hall of Fame someday, I think this is a case where it's going to be addition by subtraction. I think they're going to be actually a lot better, I think, for losing a guy like Antonio Brown, because he was a guy that was just too much of a distraction in the locker room. And we've seen with the antics that he's pulled in Oakland with the Raiders, with the helmet issue and the frostbite issue and some of the other stuff where he's calling out Big Ben Roethlisberger and Juju Smith-Schuster on social media. I think it was a good time to get some value for him and move on, because he just wasn't – for every great thing that he did on the field, there was a negative thing that he did in the locker room that kind of dragged the team down, I think. So that was a good move to kind of move on and cut their losses there. They also lost some talented players at other positions, though, like Jesse James at tight end, losing him to the Lions. They lost John Bostic and Morgan Burnett on that defense, respectively. Those aren't major losses, but it certainly were positions that they needed to address in the draft and in the free agency period as a whole. So in terms of the additions that they made, they brought in Steve Nelson, cornerback from the Kansas City Chiefs on a 3-year, $25.5 million contract. Now, I thought that deal was a little bit rich for Steve Nelson because the biggest compliment that I can give him is that he was the only guy in that Kansas City Chiefs secondary that wasn't complete trash last year, which isn't much of a compliment because that Kansas City Chiefs secondary was just not good whatsoever last year. And that was really the main reason why the Chiefs didn't make the Super Bowl last year, because their secondary just couldn't stop anybody. So I guess Nelson was the best of that group, but I don't know if he's all that great anyway. So maybe in the Steelers, where they have I guess a solid foundation on defense, you would assume that he could be better this season. They also brought in Mark Barron at linebacker, who's, again, he's a safety linebacker type of hybrid type of guy, but he's not as good as he was a couple seasons ago, but he's still a solid role player, I think, in the right scenario. And then on offense, they brought in Dante Moncrief to kind of add some veteran production at wide receiver on a 2-year, $9 million contract. So moving on to the draft, I think obviously the most surprising move for me in the first round was when the Steelers moved up all the way from 20 to 10, trading up with the Denver Broncos to select Devin Bush, linebacker out of Michigan. And to me, yes, in most traditional circles, you don't want to give up that many picks in the first round for a non-quarterback, especially for an off-ball linebacker. But I think considering the need and considering how the Steelers value that off-ball inside linebacker in their defense and the talent that Devin Bush has, I thought that was the perfect pick at the perfect time for the perfect team. Devin Bush is a guy who's going to fill in for that Ryan Shazier replacement very well coming out of Michigan. A very fast, explosive athlete, very good instincts. He hits very hard. He's not afraid to be physical. He's not afraid to get his hands dirty, certainly in the running game. And he's a guy that's going to be able to cover tight ends and running backs out of the backfield and just be a total kind of leader for this defense that they've desperately needed ever since Shazier had that very scary and unfortunate spinal cord injury a couple seasons ago. So Devin Bush, I thought that was a home run draft pick for them. I really like that pick for the Steelers. And then in the third round, they added to their wide receiver core once again with Deontay Johnson out of Toledo. Now, Johnson isn't a guy with explosive athletic traits, and coming from a small school, I think for most teams, I would question the value there because I certainly did not have him as a third-round type of talent. But I will give the Steelers the benefit of the doubt. They're one of these franchises. I think they are most definitely the best franchise in all of football at evaluating wide receivers, developing wide receivers, and then with a quarterback like Ben Roethlisberger, putting wide receivers in a great position to succeed at the NFL level. They from whether it's Hines Ward, Plexico Burress, Santonio Holmes, Emmanuel Sanders, Mike Wallace, Antonio Brown, Juju Smith-Schuster, all those guys. None of those guys were really highly touted coming out of college, and all those guys were stars for the Steelers at some point in their careers. So you have to trust that they will develop him eventually into a difference maker type of guy for this team, or at least a very solid contributor. Some other picks that I like for them, Benny Snell, while I wasn't necessarily high on him as a fourth-round pick, a running back out of Kentucky, I think he fits what the Pittsburgh Steelers want to do with their running backs in terms of having that old-school smash-mouth power type of running game. That's Benny Snell's style. He's not really much of a receiver. He's not really quick, not really explosive in the open field, but he's a very nice power back and a nice change of pace to James Conner at that running back position. In the sixth round, I like the pick of Sutton Smith, outside linebacker out of Northern Illinois. Now, Sutton Smith isn't a guy that will necessarily be a pass rusher at the next level. He's just way too undersized, but he can really fill a void, I think, on special teams. And that's what you're picking in the sixth round. It's guys that can eventually be depth players or special teams contributors. That's what you want from your sixth and seventh round picks. Sutton Smith really fits that description very well. So overall, when I break down this roster, looking at the offense first, it's going to be hard, I think, to replace Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell's production. Don't get me wrong, because those guys are the cream of the crop at their position groups. But I think overall, I mentioned it before, this is totally a situation where you're looking at it as an addition by subtraction. Obviously, they still have Ben Roethlisberger here at quarterback, and I question his leadership at times. I don't think he's always the best leader in terms of he lets some information out into the media. He kind of is passive aggressive with his guys, I think, in the media, and he, just at times just not has not been the leader that the Steelers have wanted out of him. But he's still a top 10 quarterback. He was a guy who led the league in receiving yards last year. He's still got a lot left in the tank, even at his age, and he's going to be helped out by a very talented team around him as well. You have James Conner and Benny Snell in the running back position, so you're going to have a power running game, and you combine that with one of the best offensive lines in the NFL. When you look at this team, obviously Alejandro Villanueva at left tackle, Ramon Foster at left guard, Marquise Pouncey, one of the best centers in all football, and then David DeCastro, who's probably the third or fourth best right guard in all of football. There's a lot of talents up front here. My only question mark is at right tackle, where right now they have Matt Filer slated to start there. And the only reason this is a concern for me is while in years past, I would have no problem with them developing some of those younger players at the offensive line position. But they lost their offensive line coach and Mike Munchak to the Denver Broncos. So that's definitely something to look out for if injuries do start to pile up for this team along the offensive line this season. Now, in terms of at the wide receiver position, they're going to need someone to step up. Obviously, Juju Smith-Schuster is a legitimate number one, and he's a stud. He's a guy that could potentially have a very big year this season. But they're going to need some of these younger guys to fill that void of Antonio Brown. I'm looking at guys like James Washington, who's looked very good in the preseason, Eli Rogers, Ryan Switzer. They signed Dante Moncrief, who's going to be a solid number two for them. Deontay Johnson, the rookie. One of these guys is going to have to play a big role for them. Switching over to the defense, this is a very solid unit overall. I think they're very good up front when you look at some of the talent here. Starts with Cam Hayward, very good right defensive end. Stephon Tuitt, Javon Hargrave. All three of those guys are very good players, and they have some solid depth as well with guys like Tyson Alualu, Isaiah Buggs, the guy they drafted out of Alabama in the draft. Very good up front. They're going to be able to stop the run. Very big space eaters up there. And there's a good set of edge rushers as well. You have T.J. Watt at one edge, and then you have Bud Dupree at the other edge. They lack some depth at that spot, but if those two can stay healthy, I like the pass rush. They're going to get there. In terms of one issue that is going to be fixed for them, I think, is Devin Bush. He's going to have a Ryan Shazier-like impact on this team. Having that athletic inside linebacker that can do just about everything is such a big thing to have in today's modern NFL. And Bush, I think, could be a guy that we're talking as a defensive rookie of the year because of the impact. Maybe not, he won't put up the biggest numbers necessarily, but he will just have such a huge overall influence on this defense as a whole, I think. If there are any questions, it's the secondary. They need some of their younger players that they've drafted to step up. I mentioned before how those Steelers are maybe the best at developing wide receivers, but they might be the worst in the NFL at drafting and developing secondary players, it seems like. Terrell Edmonds at strong safety was a guy they drafted in the first round last year. That was a guy that I thought that was a 2 or 3 round reach, and he certainly played like that in his first season, so they're going to need to get something out of him. Looking at their starters here at cornerback, they have Joe Hayden, who's still a pretty good player at this stage. Steven Nelson, Mike Hilton. So they have some veteran stopgaps in there to hopefully hold serve for this team. But they need guys like Artie Burns to step up, Justin Lane, who they just drafted. Sean Davis needs to develop as a free safety. If they can get some development and some solid play out of those guys, though, this defense could be a potentially top 10 unit because of all the talent that is in the front seven. So overall, when I look at the Steelers, like I mentioned before, I think this could be a situation where this team can really rally around each other with all the stuff that has kind of happened, the turmoil with the tragic passing of their coach Drake, all the off-the-field drama that happened last year, and kind of getting rid of some of that talent, getting some of that us against the world mentality here. I think Mike Tomlin has the opportunity to put together one of his better coaching jobs that he's ever had in his career. I think worst-case scenario, the lack of talent makes them an 8-8 team, still competitive, because when you have Ben Roethlisberger, you're going to be a competitive team. But I think best case scenario, they're going to be an 11-win team, and that's where I have them. I think they're going to rally around each other and win the division and go 11-5 this season. I just have a feeling about this team this year, but that's how I see the Steelers. So that's my preview for the AFC North. The next video, I'll be going to the NFC once again, to the last division in the NFC West, taking a look over at that division. Thank you guys for watching. Please leave a like and subscribe if you like this content. And, yeah, thanks for watching.